So, May, this year is 70 years anniversary since the end of the Vietnam War, or at least the repatriation, release of POWs, a really big event. I always note that, you know, as a Iraqi freedom and Afghan veteran, when I came back off the plane, you know, I had like crowds cheering and welcoming me, and not so much for our Vietnam veterans. So to you guys and gals who were involved in that conflict, God bless you. You did your duty as you should, and you deserved a lot better.
Welcome home.
We are recording this.
Okay.
So if you're having, if John's going to take any questions and answers or whatnot, just be aware of that.
Okay.
And I think you guys are going to use this perhaps for, you know, some of your family members, so that ought to be a pretty cool thing. So I will get out of the way, and John, the stage is yours.
I want to thank the General and my wife for roping me into this. The title of my talk is 50 years, celebrating 50 years of freedom, and I'm going to try to explain why I am celebrating. Susan and I, my lovely wife Susan, Peachtree City for 35 years. We're both from Clayton, New Jersey. I went to the Air Force Academy, and Susan went to the nursing program at the University of Delaware. After we got our degrees, we got married and moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I got a master's degree in applied mathematics. Sue was the biggest breadwinner, working in the emergency room at Wake County Medical Center. We then moved to Laughlin Air Force Base, Del Rio, Texas, where I went through pilot training. Sue still brought home the biggest paycheck working as in the first aid office on the Amistad Dam project that was being built across the Rio Grande. My next assignment was training in the A-37. Things have already turned off. Bear with me just a second. I've lost control.
There you go. You got it.
The A-37 is a two-engine jet, subsonic, carried napalm bombs, rockets, and had a nose gun. It'll become pretty obvious that I'm not a member of the speaking club. And if I confuse you by getting things backward, make sure that I correct it. Okay, so we're going through pilot training. Sue's working on the PM, and my next assignment is the A-37. Sue gave up the major breadwinner title and gave birth to our son, JB. We trained a brand new squadron on the A-37. It was a reconstituted squadron from World War II, the 90th Attack Squadron. We trained for 6 months in Louisiana, and then maintenance took the wings off the aircraft and slid the wings and fuselage onto the cargo bay of transports and flew the aircraft to Benoit, South Vietnam, which is 20 miles just northeast of Saigon. Okay. And on this map, Saigon is down here. We flew the A-37s for a year. I flew 211 missions that were mostly close air support for troops in contact. And after a year, we did in fact turn them over to South Vietnamese pilots who had been training back in the States. Susan and I then moved to Tampa, Florida, MacDill Air Force Base for training on the F-4. The F-4 is a two-engine jet, Mach 2 airspeed, with a front seater. You're allowed to say front seater, but you're not allowed to say back seater, and I'm going to mess up. So you all yell at me when I do that. But a weapon system officer in the back, a WSO or a WISO. I'm going to try to refer to him as WISO the whole time tonight. Okay, so after completing training at MacDill, I was assigned to the 308 TAC Fighter Squadron at Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. A little history: in 1968, President Johnson had ordered a bombing halt north of the DMZ that separated North and South Vietnam. This was the impetus for the Paris peace talks. 4 years later, now President Nixon threatened to resume bombing in North Vietnam unless there was progress in the peace talks. No progress being made, President Nixon deployed the 308 TDY to Udorn, Thailand on March 28, 1972. JB and Susan, who was now pregnant with our daughter Becky, remained in base housing at Homestead. We flew the F-4s to Udorn, Thailand. Let me see where I am. Udorn is right here, and the reason we were going to Udorn because it's the closest U.S. base to North Vietnam. Although the Navy was out here and landing on boats, why you do that, I don't know. But they were flying out of the Tonkin Gulf, and the Marine pilots also. And the Army guys were doing the real fighting down here in South Vietnam. Okay, and the reason you get as close as you can to North Vietnam for your base of operations is because in air-to-air combat, fuel is all important. You can't park it on the side of the road when you run out of gas. Okay, we flew the F-4. Did I say this? We flew the F-4s from...
No, you didn't. From Homestead.
From home, thank you, my editor-in-chief.
Babies.
We flew the F-4s from Homestead to Udorn, Thailand, with stops in Hawaii and Guam and many air-to-air refuelings in between. Okay. Still knowing where I am. Okay, one of the first orders of business upon arrival in New Dorn was a briefing by the wing weapons officer, Bob Lodge, on frequencies, tactics, and procedures. Bob Lodge had been a senior at the Air Force Academy when I was a freshman. One of the first things you do in your first month of life at the Academy is go on a survival trek up in the Rockies for 5 days. Bob Lodge was in charge of my 10-man element of freshmen, and he was the perfect fit for that job because he spent his weekends at the Academy hunting and fishing while backpacking up in the mountains. He was a little different than the average cadet. I'm not saying that hunting and fishing and backpacking is bad, but not many cadets did that on their weekends. Okay, and once again, I have lost my place. I'll find it shortly. On 9 May, getting back to Southeast Asia, on 9 May 1972, President Nixon, following up on his threats, enacted Operation Linebacker, which resumed missions over North Vietnam. On 10 May, 1 day later, after having shot down MiG, Bob Lodge and his Wizzo, I got Wizzo right, not bad singer. Bob Lodge and his Wizzo, Roger Locker, were themselves shot down. Their flight call sign was Oyster. The rest of Oyster Flight saw no shoots nor heard any calls on the survival radio that all crew members carried. Bob Lodge was known for briefing his Wizzo that if they were shot down, he was going to ride it in, as he knew too much as the wing weapons officer to become a prisoner of war. Like I said, he was a little different. The rest of Oyster Flight spent the reserve fuel searching for any survivors with no luck. The next day, the monsoons arrived, and they shut down routes over Laos to the north. So we would fly out to the Tonkin Gulf, get air refueled, and then fly west over North Vietnam. This took more fuel, so it wasn't the preferred route. And so for 3 weeks, the monsoons were over Southeast Asia, and we had to fly out over the water and be with the Navy guys. On 1 June, there was a break in the weather, and for the first time, we resumed flights over Laos into the north. So for the first time in 3 weeks, we flew over the area that Roger Locker and Bob Lodge had been shot down. Somebody heard a call on guard saying, "This is Oyster 1 Bravo. I'm ready for pickup. What took you guys so long?" It was Roger Locker. After Roger's position was pinpointed, an H-53 Sikorsky helicopter came in and picked him up. I thought this was going to work smoother. Bear with me. This is an HH-53, a Sikorsky. That's not what I want. Okay, and I thought that flying a helicopter into North Vietnam was a pretty gutsy move. We returned to Udorn and waited for about an hour for the Sikorsky to make it to Udorn. It came in and landed, and there was a big gathering around it, and off of the helicopter walked Roger Lockwood. And right behind him was the pilot of the Sikorsky, Dale Stovall. Dale Stovall was a classmate and fellow track team member of mine at the Academy. So while they were toasting Roger in the yacht club, Dale and I chewed the fat. On 27 June 1972, on my 44th mission over Udorn, we were flying MidCap just west of Hanoi in support of, we were just west of Hanoi, orbiting in support of the linebacker strike force that day. And I was going to say backseater, but I caught myself. My wizard that day was Dave Dingy. Okay, we're in orbit just west of Hanoi when we got a radio call from Red Crown, which is an airborne radar service facility, about a blue bandit to our north. It was up here someplace. So Lee turned the flight to the north in a big right turn, and the four Wizzos started scanning on the radar for the MiG. A blue bandit is a MiG-21. They did use colors for different MiGs. So this was a MiG-21, but nobody was picking him up. And the linebacker strike was just starting to get hot and heavy, so there was all kinds of radio chatter on the frequency. And like I said, none of the Wizzos could make radar. Did I say that? None of the Wizzos could make radar contact with it. And Lee called Red Crown several times for updates on the bandit's position, but there was no response. Since we were now nearing the Chinese border, Lee made a big left-hand turn to the south to head south. Halfway through the turn, Dave and I felt a big thump in the aircraft. The nose pitched up, stalled out, did a falling leaf maneuver, flipped over on his back, and went into an inverted spin. We immediately had lost all radio and cockpit communication. Halfway through the falling leaf maneuver, I saw Dave eject in the rear. We have rear view mirrors up here. I saw Dave eject halfway through the falling leaf maneuver. Incidentally, this was Dave's first flight in a month, as he and another pilot had been hit by a surface-to-air missile a month earlier, but were able to make it back to friendly territory before they had to eject. Dave injured his back in the ejection and had been rehabilitating for a month. And this was his first flight back. He eventually got the moniker Magnetas for his double shoot down. Okay, so I'm in this upside down spin, but the F4 is easy to recover from a spin with all its dihedral flight control surfaces. I went through the spin recovery procedures, but I had no success. And I couldn't feel any back pressure in the rudder pedals or the control stick. The aircraft had lost all its hydraulics, and the hydraulics are necessary for moving the control surfaces. And next picture. Because of the slant.
It's up higher. Down. Higher. There it is.
Okay. This isn't a very good picture, but you can get the idea. There's a slant to the way the cockpit sits on the fuselage, and the backseater, Wizzo, the Wizzo sits higher than the front seater. Like I said, you can say front seater, but the Wizzo, so the Wizzo can see the tail, and the front seater cannot. I don't know if you can see this very good. It was the only picture that was available of this. This is actually Dave and me in the aircraft the day we were shot down. My mother always got teary-eyed because the nose art was a heart with Mom over it. So I never told her that the nose art on the aircraft is a choice of that aircraft's crew chief and not the pilots that fly it. The pilots change one almost every flight. So Dave could see the tail of the aircraft, and he said that it was gone. So he knew that there was no chance of recovery, and he figured that the higher he jumped out, the further he could float from the crash site, which would increase his chances of escape and evasion. He said he announced his departure, but we were incommunicado at the time. I looked at my altimeter as it was unwinding below 10,000 feet and ejected. When the parachute opened, I could see that I was coming down over rice fields growing in a valley between ridge lines that were rising to higher mountains to the west. I made a 4-line cut in the parachute, and this just allows you to steer the parachute in its descent. So I started heading for the jungle-covered ridge lines to the west. And my idea was, once I got in the jungle, escaping or on a ridge line, escape and evasion would be more likely, easier. As soon as I crashed through the jungle canopy and got out of my chute, I could hear voices at the bottom of the ridge I had landed on. I remembered Roger Locker saying that he thought getting to the other side of the ridge line that he landed on before the search party arrived allowed him to avoid capture. So I set out to get to the other side of the ridge that I landed on. But it only took me about 10 minutes to get to the top. This was just a small foothill. And when I got to the top, I could now hear voices all around. I saw a pile of loose vegetation in a washout gully and burrowed as deep as I could into it. Twice I heard voices right beside me without being discovered, and I hoped that if I could stay hidden until nightfall, I might be able to slip away. But it was 9 o'clock in the morning. And shortly I heard more voices, and I felt the pile's pressure change on my leg. There was a yell followed by a lot of commotion and a brain freeze on my part. I just laid still, hoping against hope that maybe the yell was because of a snake or something else. Then they started shooting in the pile into the gully. I quickly rose to my feet, and they all jumped on me and started pounding away. There was a gunshot and loud orders in Vietnamese. The orders were coming from a little guy with a pith helmet on and a pistol in his hand. They stopped pounding, stripped me to my shorts, tied my wrist, put a leash around my neck, and we started out on a parade of the local villages. Now I was barefoot and walking in the jungle, and I worried about my feet, among other things. That evening, we came into the Yump village, and there was Dave with his own entourage. The next day, they put us in the back of a Jeep, and we spent 2 days driving to Hanoi. Dave and I were put in solitary cells in Wallow Prison, Wallow was a French prison built in 1896 when Vietnam was a colony of the French. We call Wallow the Hanoi Hill. The GIs called Wallow Prison the Hanoi Hill. And the solitary cells that they put Dave and I in were called Heartbreak Hotel. I immediately had an interrogation, and the interrogator said that I was going to meet with some media people. It's time for my medication. Okay, let me try to get this straight down.
I don't know this could only happen if we continue
Okay, so I was being interrogated, and the interrogator said he wanted more information than is required by the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention says you only have to give name, rank, service number, and date of birth. He wanted unit, aircraft, target, space, shoot-down date, fellow pilot names, and weapons information, among a lot of other stuff. When I declined, he said I wouldn't be able to go to the show and tell, and he repeated his list of demands again. When he got to date of shoot-down, I said, okay. And he accepted. I always wondered, I didn't always wonder, I know now. I wondered why they settled for shoot-down date. And it turns out that on that date, the North Vietnamese shot down more aircraft than on any other day of the war. And that's what the media event was all about. I had 3 more interrogations while I was in solitary. Heartbreak. And Dave had developed an infection in his foot from a cut he got on our parade of villages after our shoot-down. And things started to get crowded at Heartbreak after a month because of more shoot-downs. So they moved Dave into my cell. By now, Dave's foot was oozing pus, and we drained it into our honey bucket every day. Soon a black and blue line ran up his leg to his groin, and his skin was hot to touch. That night, Dave became delirious and incoherent. I yelled for the guards, and I caused a commotion, but when things finally got settled, they brought in a little guy in a white coat with a syringe, and they gave Dave a shot and left. In a little while, Dave blew up like the Pillsbury Doughboy. I yelled again and was completely unresponsive now. I yelled for the guard again, which caused another commotion. And the little white coat came in and gave Dave another shot. After a while, Dave was talking again. And then he informed me that he was allergic to penicillin. After 39 days in Heartbreak, they moved Dave and me to a big cell in another section of Wallow. And this cell handled 30 to 50 POWs, depending on how they were moving prisoners around at the time. This is a museum presentation that they have right now in North Vietnam. It's been prettied up for the public viewing. But this was the big cell that handled 30 to 50 people. And everybody in the big cell that I was in was a recent shoot down. And in the other cells that were nearby, there were POWs that had been there a long time. They were FOGs, FOGs, effing old guys. And they called us FNGs, effing new guys. At one time, everybody that was shot down before the bombing calls in 1968 was considered a FOG, and everybody afterwards was an FNG. So by the time Dave and I got there, some 4-year POWs were being called FNGs. This was confusing, and I just knew that I never wanted to be considered a FOG. By the time Dave and I moved into the big cell, the FOGs had established an elaborate communication system. And that was all important to the well-being of the POWs, mentally and physically. Originally, an adaptation of Morse code was used with various techniques to represent dots and dashes. It could be sent using taps and scrapes on a wall, short sweeps and long sweeps with a broom, coughs and spits that sometimes made it sound like a tuberculosis ward. One method even used the order laundry was hung out to dry. But this was real snail mail, and it could take months to send messages this way. And it almost resulted in a tragedy for the Santé radio. One guy was killed, so it was a tragedy. If the communicators could see each other, a flash code was used. It was just a form of sign language. Some of the FOGs, in these big rooms, you could communicate, but the rules were you couldn't talk loud enough so the people on the outside of the cell could hear you. There was no glass in these ones. These were just steel bars, iron bars. And so somebody on the other side of the wall, if they wanted to, could listen in. So everybody was whispering. Some of the FOGs were very hard of hearing, so they used, in the big cell, they would use the flash code to talk to each other. And by the time Dave and I got there, a tap code was being used. This was based on a 5x5 grid of the alphabet minus the letter Z. So you tap 3 times for the third row, 2 times for the third column, 2 times for the second row, and that would designate the letter that you meant. The FOGs, people became very proficient at this. And after a while, it sounded like there was a woodpecker infestation of the camp. And the guards were trying to discover people communicating all the time, and they could hear these taps, but they could never figure out what they meant. This was just the tip of the iceberg of POW communication. They had drops and hollowed out sticks and all kinds of methods of communicating. They had enough time to come up with these. Another concern was food. There just wasn't enough. Around 10 a.m., a gong would sound for the morning meal, which was a cup of tea and bread. The bread contained hundreds of bugs, not all dead. For days, I couldn't eat the bread, but eventually, I would spend hours picking the bugs out of the bread. I'd end up with a little pile of crumbs and a little pile of bugs. I'd throw the bugs into the honey bucket and eat the crumbs. After a while doing this, I reasoned that bugs are protein and ate the bread whole. It wasn't long before bread was my favorite entree on the menu. Around 5 p.m., the gong would sound for the second and final meal of the day. This meal was a cup of tea and a bowl of whatever was the crop for that growing season. For weeks when I got there, it was something green in water that we called weeds. Then it changed to cut up rinds of some kind of gourd in water that we called pumpkin soup. Occasionally we had chunks of fat that had been trimmed off slaughtered pigs along with the skin and hair. We spent hours talking about food. We had the time to talk. After 3 months, I had a fifth interrogation, which was rather unusual for that time period. And in the interrogation room, the interrogator had left the door to the room open and into a dark hallway, and I got the feeling that somebody was out there. The interrogator wanted to know what a poll was, since Nixon was leading in one back in the United States, and the North Vietnamese didn't have anything like that. When I got back to the big cell, again, we spent hours trying to figure out what that interrogation really was about. On 23 October 1972, Nixon ended the linebacker campaign. The skies were quiet over Hanoi. Most POWs thought that this was bad news, and a gloom settled over the camp. Then on 18 December 1972, 2 months later, Nixon ordered linebacker 2, which included, that's not 2 months, is that right? 23 or 2? Yeah, 2 months.
Yes.
Nixon ordered linebacker 2, which included B-52 bombings over North Vietnam. For years, when a brand new FNG arrived in camp and the Fogs finally made contact with him through the communication network, they would ask the FNG when he thought we would be going home. The FNG always came up with a theory and a date. The Fogs would respond, "That's nice, keep the faith, but don't be discouraged when that date passes, everybody's has." However, when the first string of B-52 bombs landed in Hanoi, the Fogs got on the network and said, "We're going home." Food got better. They tore the bamboo walls down in the courtyard so that we could see across. They let us mingle with the Fogs. You'd come in at the end of the day and your cheeks would be sore from smiling so much. Okay, and they also, I'm sorry. They also gave us brand new go-home clothes to wear on the flight back home. This is in fact, and now they released POWs to go home in the order of shoot down. So the guys that were there the longest went home first, and the FMGs went home last. This is my group. I'm in the back right, so you can't see me, and we're at Gia Lam Airport, which serves Hanoi, getting ready to leave. This is Jim Williams, who lives in Tucker, Georgia. You can't make it out, but Dave Dingy is back here. And Kevin Cheney's the last man on the left. Kevin Cheney lives in Peachtree City. Susan and I saw him just a couple of weeks ago. Okay, what was next?
The plane ride.
Oh, you're right. My editor-in-chief. And this is the flight I was on just after the cockpit made an announcement that we were clear of North Vietnam airspace. I'm right here. This is Dave Dingy back here. And a lot of other good-looking guys.
Far right. Second row, yeah.
Back in the States, there were all kinds of parades. Okay. There were all kinds of parades, celebrations, and reunions. And the White House put up a huge tent on the South Lawn and served the biggest formal dinner that's ever been served to the POWs. There was President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Bob Hope, John Wayne, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Heatherton, Jimmy Stewart, Miss America, and many more celebrities. Vic Damone sat at Susan's and my table. That's what we rated, Vic Damone. I shouldn't say that. During this affair, Susan was mistaken for Joey Heatherton, and this made her day. After the hoopla was over, I got a job with Delta Airlines and flew for 30 years, retiring in 2003. Dave died of cancer in 2012.
There's his picture. Did you get the first picture?
You saw it?
Yes, go down further. Yes, stop there. Stop.
There's Dave. Dave died in 2003 of cancer, and they had an F-4 flyby, missing man formation flyby, at his graveside ceremony. In 2013, Susan and I went on a Southeast Asia cruise sponsored by the service academies. At a stop in Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be Saigon, Sue and I went to the War Remnants Museum. Right inside the entrance gate.
Stop, go down. There.
Right inside the entrance gate was an A-37 that I had flown. 2 ports of call later, instead of going on the tour bus with the rest of the passengers, Susan and I rented a car, driver and guide, and went to the Hanoi Hilton. Voila. They have erected high-rise condo buildings on half of the prison property, but a museum exists on the other half that includes some of my old cells.
You passed it. It's right there. Stop. There. Susan in uniform.
We used a rented car because I wasn't sure how I would react to the visit. It turned out to be unemotional for me, which is unusual for me. Our guy was fresh out of college, and he wanted to practice his English on us. He related how his parents met as teenagers hauling supplies on the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the Viet Cong. So I didn't tell him that I dropped a lot of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 2010, Delta Airlines started code sharing with Vietnam Airlines. Charlie Tutt, the Delta Airline chief pilot, was involved in the negotiations. And across the table was the CEO of Vietnam Airlines, General Nguyen Duc Swat. Swat was also one of the founders of Mekong Air that had merged with Vietnam Airlines. Swat was also the former chief of staff of the Vietnamese Air Force. Swat was also the MiG-21 ace that shot Dave and me down. Charlie invited Swat and other North Vietnam combat pilots to visit the U.S. And when Charlie got back to the U.S., he gave me a call and invited me to meet with the Vietnamese in San Diego. I was hesitant and apprehensive. Several U.S. pilots said no. Charlie said Swat had mentioned me by name and caught me a little off guard, and I said okay. We met in San Diego for 3 days. Everyone was civil and cordial, and it wasn't long before the atmosphere had the feeling of happy hour at the O Club. I asked Swat about the 5th interrogation, and he said yes, he was out in the hallway out of curiosity. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention. This is the general. And about once a year, the general's aide sends me an email with an update on SWAT's status. A lot like your aide, right, General?
Of course.
Okay. In 11 days, Sue and I are going to the Nixon compound in Yorba Linda. It's the Nixon Library, but it's in the old Nixon compound in Yorba Linda to celebrate 50 years of freedom with the remaining POWs, and there's less than half still alive. They are going to serve the same meal that was served 50 years ago at the White House to Joey Heatherton. At these reunions, some of the folks relate that they still get an adrenaline rush from being able to open up a door. Because for 6, 7, 8 years they couldn't. I was there for 9 months. Everett Alvarez, a Navy A-4 pilot, was there for almost 9 years. I don't even think about being a POW unless somebody brings it up. And don't get me wrong, I don't mind talking about it, but I usually don't bring it up by myself. Like most fighter pilots, I thought I was God's gift to aviation. Being shot down by another fighter pilot was a coup de grace to my ego. Now I feel like an interloper when I go to these FOG reunions and listen to the FOG stories. But Sue and I are going to keep going. Besides grandkids, one of the perks of growing old is getting to see old friends at the reunions. And there is lots of good food there. I thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm not sure there's much else to say after that. But, you know, to John and Susan, you know, thank you. Now, I've spoken with them a little bit more, and there's a whole lot more stories to this, so as time goes on. But one, maybe Susan, you could tell about how your letters didn't get read, sent, and you were able still to communicate. So it wasn't just, we focus right on the POWs, and a lot of times we focus on the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen, but think about the families that are back home in any deployment, but especially, the uncertainty, and then what's going on, and then having a child during that period. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm astonished. I mean, Susan, do you want to tell it, or I'll tell it for you?
I'll try and do it.
Okay, all right.
Move that a little bit so I get,
Okay.
there you go.
We'll see how this goes.
He's bringing in microphone.
You want the mic?
I guess if I need it, I'll just hold it. Is this okay?
No, it's not on.
It's good.
So you hold it on the mic.
What?
Flip the switch on.
Hold it.
Is it on?
Just hold it.
Put it right close to your mouth. Right close.
Anyway.
Right close.
We were very fortunate compared to a lot of people in so many ways, if anyone is We were very fortunate in many ways. For one thing, when John was shot down, he was TDY, and we were still living on base. And apparently, although most POWs weren't on TDY tours, most of them were on permanent tours, so they didn't have that situation. But in the past, before us, the TDY families then had to move off the base. And we were fortunate that it was towards what they were hoping was the war was going to end any day now. It didn't, but so the higher-ups decided that Linda and I and our kids were allowed to stay on base, and that was positive for us.
Linda was Dave's. Linda was Dave's.
Linda Dingy was Dave's wife. And so we had the whole rest of his squadron was still over there in Udorn for several more months. So it was a good place for us to be. Another thing was that we were allowed through the Red Cross to send one letter, a little tiny letter, a month through the Red Cross, and the prisoners were allowed to send one back to us. And that worked to a degree. But our daughter was born 6 months after he left, 3 months after he was shot down. And at those days, you didn't know whether they were having a son or a daughter until it happened. And anyway, so I was sending the letters, you have a daughter, and, on that September's letter. But then they didn't deliver them. The North Vietnamese didn't deliver them to John. Sent them back saying, nope, not deliver them, because once they read it and saw that it was something happy, they didn't want to let him know about that. However, Linda wrote to Dave, mentioning me, our son, and Becky. So 3 months after the fact, Dave told John he had a daughter. That was what I mean. And many years later, at the Air Force Academy, they, maybe 15 years ago at the most, they had the dedication of the Vietnam Pavilion. You've seen that by now, right? Yeah. And so we were all out there for that. And they had engraved lists at this pavilion of all the classes with all their members that had been killed in Vietnam. And then in another section, they had an engraved list of all of the alumni who had become prisoners of war, not by class, but by shoot-down date. And John's class of 67 and Jim George's class of 67 had the most members killed of any of the academy classes. 19 of their classmates were killed. But they had the least amount of POWs in their class, 1. So we were the lucky. That was not it. It was a good part.